But we move on, and tensions between the United States and Iran have escalated sharply. This comes after President Donald Trump threatened unprecedented bombing if Tehran refuses a new nuclear deal. In response, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, warned of a strong blow if the US takes action. Iranian state media reports that the country has readied missiles capable of striking US positions across the world. Meanwhile, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian rejected direct talks but left room for indirect negotiations through Oman. As the standoff intensifies, both sides brace for a potential showdown. Washington has also hinted at reintroducing secondary tariffs, further pressuring Tehran. Analysts warn that miscalculations could trigger a wider conflict in the region. With indirect negotiations still on the table, the coming weeks will be critical in determining whether diplomacy or confrontation prevails. Well, joining us to discuss these developments is Daniel Roth, the researcher, director of the United Against Nuclear Iran, joining us from New York. Daniel, thank you very much, firstly, for joining us. To provide our audience some context, why is it so crucial that a nuclear deal is agreed with Iran?
Sorry, your guest. Could your guest just mute himself? Thank you, Mr. Hyde. Why is a nuclear deal so crucial with Iran? Well, because the Islamic Republic of Iran, by its very nature, is a revanchist radical regime that wishes to export its definition of radical Islam, not just around the region, but across the world. And that Iran with a nuclear weapon would have an umbrella that would be very difficult to penetrate. It would threaten US allies throughout that region, and indeed, you can imagine it on some vessel threatening the United States. We saw Iran last year carry nuclear-capable missiles on its vessels, in the Western Hemisphere for the first time, and around Indonesia, around the South Pacific as well. So, ultimately, as President Trump has said, and as was echoed by his predecessor and his predecessor before that, it is absolutely unacceptable that Iran gets a nuclear weapon.
Yes, Daniel, before we move on to the comments that were made by both Trump and Iran's supreme leader, I have a question for you relating to the previous deal that was done. Of course, in 2015, a deal of leading nations was agreed with Iran, but in 2018, the US was withdrawn from that, and that has seen an increase potentially in Iranian nuclear capabilities and planned capabilities. Is this Donald Trump trying to rectify a mistake he made in his own first term?
I think let's just go back to that deal. There's quite a few misconceptions about what it actually entailed. So let's say the propaganda around that deal was that it prevented Iran getting a nuclear weapon. It did no such thing. It simply delayed Iran's ability to acquire the materials to get a nuclear weapon for a certain period, so for a period of 10, 15 years. Once that period was lifted, which is 10 years after, it was 2015, as you rightly said, it's now 2025, Iran would be legally allowed to get materials for nuclear capabilities, nuclear weapons capabilities. So that's the first thing. In terms of Trump rectifying his mistakes, I agreed with his decision to withdraw from the nuclear deal. The US tried accommodation under President Obama. It did not work. That resulted in this JCPOA nuclear deal. It then tried appeasement under President Biden, or really ignoring Iran and its nefarious behavior. I think it's time now to try again assertiveness. There was a period of 2 years from 2018 to 2020 where maximum pressure, this idea that full sanctions would be imposed and enforced. That resulted in Iran's foreign exchange coming down to the low hundreds of millions from peaks of tens of billions. Unfortunately, Trump was not able to continue his policy. Obviously, he was elected out, but he's now got 4 years to continue that policy. And I think this is the way to go.
Yes, Daniel, looking forward now and looking at potential escalation that could have ramifications across the Middle East and elsewhere. Trump putting it plainly that he would strike Iran if a deal wasn't agreed upon. Do you think he would actually follow through with that, given some previous comments made by Trump that haven't always come to fruition?
I think the president, like Americans at large, is instinctively he's an isolationist. He doesn't want, U.S. ground troops. He doesn't want America to be involved in every single conflict around the world. And as I say, I think that is a sentiment that's shared by Americans. So it's significant that he is making these very tough warnings against the regime in Tehran. I think he just understands the nature of it, as I was talking about it in my first response. He understands that the Islamic Republic of Iran is not going to back down. They're not simply going to, agree to a deal and then change their behavior. He understands that that pressure has to be applied seriously. So yes, he's making this threat, and like many regimes, or most of the regimes in that particular part of the world, they only respond to strength. They don't respond to appeasement. They don't respond to accommodation. So we'll see. As you mentioned, the President Pezeshkian has said, nothing's going to happen. Iran will strike back. Well, we saw Iran strike back on Israel last year, sent hundreds of ballistic missiles into Israel back in April, and then in October, the end result really was no major damage. So that was just against Israel. America, the world's most effective fighting machine. I don't think it's really going to affect the United States military and their expectations and their plans when it comes to the Islamic Republic.
Yes, absolutely. Daniel, to bring an end to our discussion, you mentioned Israel there, and of course Iran and their backed groups across the Middle East have been fighting with Israel. Does a war or does a conflict between the US and Iran pose risk to those fractious fight zones that we're seeing already in the Middle East?
Well, Israel's been at war with Hamas since October the 8th, 2023. It's also been at war really with, as you say, Iran's proxy partners and terrorist groups, including Hezbollah, the Houthis, which have caused huge damage to the world economy through, increased commercial costs, shutting down the Red Sea transit zone, for example. So the US now is trying to take care of the Houthis, focusing on them, letting Israel deal with Hamas, who continue to not release the hostages, and they could end that particular war within an hour should they choose to do so. I think President Trump understands that really the fractiousness, to use your phrase, stems from that central Tehran regime. They really are the octopus behind all these terrorist tentacles. And if anything is really going to happen long term, then the Islamic Republic is the main focus, and that needs to be dealt with.
Daniel Roth, thank you very much for joining us and providing that